Okay, welcome to FNAF Philosophy, and today I want to talk about the epistemology, or the theory of knowledge in the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, and how we use it. If you already know what this fancy word means, epistemology, I want to clarify that I'm not going to be talking about if the franchise itself or if Scott Cawthon believes in a certain theory of knowledge, and that's how we're supposed to view the series. Instead, I'm going to be talking about how we use the concept of theory of knowledge in order to approach theorizing. So this is a theory, or this is like a class on how to understand how to theorize better. I don't know. But I think this is an interesting topic. And I think it's a really important thing to cover as well, because most people have very different opinions on this stuff. And the big theorists certainly do. I think you can tell if you understand the language here how people come to their conclusions, because they're thinking fundamentally very differently, just very differently about the series and their approach to things, right? You've probably also argued with someone in the past about a theory and have had no idea how they could possibly have come to the conclusion that they did. And I think it's because they had a different understanding of their theory of knowledge in applying it to the games. That's the core of this discussion. So, what exactly is epistemology or theory of knowledge? I'm going to call it theory of knowledge moving forward, just a lot simpler. Theory of knowledge is the philosophy of sort of asking the questions of how do we know what we know? What do we actually truthfully understand or know about the real world, about ourselves, about other people, about the sky being blue? And how do we know those things? How do we come to that information in real life? I think a lot of you are saying, the things that we see and hear are pretty easy to trust, right? It's where most people lie. Some weirdos go off the deep end, but we're not going to get into that here. And then what evidence or what things in reality can or can't be trusted? Great example. That weird illusion of like clear water, like you have water in a cup. It kind of bends something in the water as you're looking at it. Now we know that's just a weird illusion that happens from the refraction of light off of the water, right? So we can't just trust that. The conclusion isn't that when you put a straw in the water, it bends or it breaks off of itself and refracts in a weird way, right? That's just a weird thing that happens with light and water. That's theory of knowledge. What do we do with the information? And what information that is coming into our eyeballs or our ears or our brains ought to be trusted? And then how do we come to certain conclusions with that? Are there certain things that should just be accepted face value? Are there other things that should be, they require a little bit more logical leaps naturally, but will help us come to the right conclusions? That's what I'm talking about here. Check out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy if you do care more about this. But if not, we can just move on. Now, in the real world, philosophers are arguing about epistemology, theory of knowledge, in the way that we're arguing about if we can have real, concrete knowledge of the world or not. If anything is certain, if you can trust your senses like sight, hearing, and smell, or if those could be wrong or made up somehow. And then other people, most people would say, yeah, there's a lot of things you can know for certain, and not just from the material world, but that there are even a few concrete truths about reality that we can know for sure are true, that don't really use the physical world as evidence, right? We kind of construct them in our mind, but we can be sure about them. A good example of this would be the famous Rene Descartes' proclamation: "I think, therefore I am." I'm a thinking being. I know that I have thoughts, regardless of what else I think is real or not. I can be certain that I exist. That's a pretty good basic start there. But let's get into let's get into the real potatoes. How do we use this when we're talking about FNAF. What am I talking about? What am I actually talking about in the execution of this in relation to FNAF? Now, you might have already figured this out based on my explanation if it was good or not, but primarily where this comes from is the canonicity, uh, or the validity of sources of knowledge in the games. Again, primarily what is canon, what has not been retconned, what we do know for certain happens in these games, and how do we know what evidence we can trust and which things we can completely write off. All of these questions involve theory of knowledge. So, obviously, one of the biggest places that this question comes into play is actually the secondary material of the franchise. What about the books? Are the books canon? Are they just entirely canon? Are only certain books canon? If we're supposed to somehow use the books to borrow ideas, names, concepts, what does that mean? What is the line in regards to that? What about the security logbook? Is that canon to the games? Most people seem to think so. And what about the guidebook, the newest guidebook with the Chica's secret party stuff going on, the new fresh off the press one? Is that canon to the games? I don't know. It's a little trickier, but I think it's supposed to tell us something, right? Or at least that's the general consensus. So only certain parts of books are maybe true. None of it's true. All of it should be taken into consideration. These are theory of knowledge questions about the importance of the sources of evidence. The same question can be applied to the movies. What about the movies? Obviously, we know the movies aren't directly just canon to the games, but it seems like there are elements from the movies that are supposed to give us hints and truths within the games. Maybe things like people speculate about the death order. It should give us some hints about the identity of Golden Freddy, maybe even info about the relationships between each of the characters. Is Vanessa from Security Breach an Afton because Vanessa is an Afton in the movies? It depends on how much you want to rely on the movies as a piece of evidence when theorizing. Some people will also go to things like the Funko Pops, Afton's character in Dead by Daylight, the what was that AR game called? I don't remember what that game was called, but a lot of people use that as some form of evidence, right? Where's the line? That is a theory of knowledge question. And then we have spin-off games, but I'll get into what I mean by that in a second. Me personally, I don't really like having to spend so much time deciding on whether or not I think the books and movies and all of this stuff is worth paying attention to. But that's the nature of theory of knowledge. It's very important to know what you think is a source of valid evidence before you start developing your conclusions, right? A lot of theories fall completely apart. If you say with any authority, nope, that's not good evidence, you can't use that evidence, the evidence is actually incorrect, wrong, or should have been inadmissible. And that's probably why you yourself personally have crossed off a lot of theories. Once people start talking about Andrew or Funko Pops or the Silver Eyes, maybe you start to go, all right, I don't know about all that. So I think you're already doing it if you're theorizing, if you're thinking about this stuff, right? You just didn't know how to put words to it. But that's enough of that, the source stuff. I want to talk about the games, specifically, very importantly. Now, obviously, we have Into the Pit. I don't want to forget that. And again, I don't want to forget the AR game as well. I forget what that's called. But I want to primarily talk about these two games. These are big games when it comes to understanding the validity of sources in theory of knowledge. What are we supposed to take from? Let's use FNAF World as an example first. Can we take anything and everything? Is it all canon or like to be used as evidence? Is it only some things? How do we know what things to use as evidence and what to ignore when it comes to FNAF World? It seems like there's something going on in that story. There's something about putting back together maybe the crying child. Who knows, right? I actually have a different video about this exact problem coming, I think, next week. Um, and the same questions, for probably different reasons, come to mind when we look at the upcoming Five Laps of Freddy's game, right? Are we allowed to use levels or characters? Um, Specifically, this car, right? These cars, very important. We allowed to use these as evidence to solve the main series? Is what actually is going on here? Did Scott Cawthon talk to Click Team, or are they just having fun or using their best guesses? Um, Again, I think this is another important question to ask when getting into the games themselves, because I think it's a very underrated question, uh, and it shapes quite a good number of theories. What you think here? If if you cross off FNAF World entirely, I think your theories about what the first six games are, more or less, and that changes a lot. But obviously, if you were to take it wholesale, you'd have to make room for like Freddy in Space. You'd have to make room for Anim Dude being, Chipper and Sons being canon somehow in the FNAF universe, right? Is it all or nothing? I think the answer is probably in between there, but where is it? That's tricky. And the same thing with Five Laps. Do we use this as evidence? Does this resolve Midnight Motorist? That's a big question. That's a really good question to have an answer to. You know what I mean? That resolves a lot of things. If you think this is total hogwash, then we're back to where we were before this game was announced, right? These are very important things to consider. Next, and I think this is not talked about enough, but it comes up every now and then. I don't know if I've heard Gibby mention it primarily, but what about the game files? This is another good example of validity of evidence. Namely, are we supposed to or intended to use the game files as serious evidence? And by that, I mean the names of certain folders or files, how models or images or levels look without the in game lighting, files that were not used in the game. Are we supposed to, cut content? Do we use cut content as valid evidence? Um, and then if you do say yes to any of these things, was this always the case? Did Scott sit down with the first FNAF game and say, you know what? Things in the game files are supposed to give away secrets? Or was that never the case? Or if it was, did it start in a later game? Did around FNAF 4, did he say, all right, people are looking at the game files, they're data mining, we'll start putting stuff in there? Did Steel Wool start with that? That was the mentality they go into it? Or is it all hogwash? That's a really good question to have an answer to, right? Or at least have an answer to for yourself when developing a theory. That might be a nail in the coffin for someone when you're explaining a theory to them. If they say, yeah, but I don't know we're supposed to use the game files. I don't know if that's what was intended. Okay, we'll get into intended in a little bit. But I think obvious, really good example of this is actually Midnight Motorist, which I just put out a video on that. My sort of nihilistic thoughts on Midnight Motorist. But I think it's a really core example of this because the famous portion of the mini game, our little mustard man right here, in the mound in the house, um, is titled Later That Night. But in regards to that, people will always ask later to what night and sort of fill that into their theory. It becomes a significant pillar in Midnight Motorist theories at times. But that's not something we know about from the game itself. We only know that it was called Later That Night because that is the reference to the file and folder in the game files from data mining. We don't learn that from the game at all. In the game, this is just, I don't know what you want to call it, a part of Midnight Motorist, a secret section of Midnight Motorist, an untitled scene. So, whether or not you're willing to take this as truly canonically being called Later That Night because we were supposed to go into the game files and know the answer to that's what it was called, or whether that is irrelevant or evidence we're just not supposed to know about, then it wouldn't be evidence at all. The answer to that question might change how you see Midnight Motorist, at least a little bit. Hope that was a good example. Now, in the main series of games, uh, which we hopefully don't have to argue about being trustworthy sources in themselves, although I guess you could. We also use theory of knowledge here to ask whether or not there are pieces of evidence that are less trustworthy or that shouldn't be considered. I realize I should have had an intermittent slide here. Not really at this yet, but go ahead, soak it in, get an understanding of it, get a little ahead of yourself if you want, or just listen to me. Um, the big categories for evidence that should be used or should not be used. Um, these would be, again, if something is either an unintended bug or an error, maybe something is just an Easter egg and not supposed to be taken completely seriously. Maybe it's a piece of evidence that has been retconned and so is therefore no longer relevant in its original game. Or maybe it's just a piece of fact that is just flavor or a small little piece of information meant to add to the world and flesh it out, but not directly meant to be scrutinized heavily or tied to other things. Again, this isn't something that I think should really be overlooked because how you think about Scott or steel wool or how certain facts come together, you might believe some pieces of evidence are outright not supposed to be used, whereas they might be the anchor to someone else's theory. And to be honest, if I get into the weeds on this one with examples, I think we could be here for hours. So I hope you will see how we could be here for hours if I went through every little example of that. So just gonna have to trust that my explanation was good enough and move on. This little it's supposed to be a line chart, a spectrum. Um, so all of that previous information about the validity of sources is all well and good, but theory of knowledge also needs to answer the question of what do we do with that evidence once we get it? How are we supposed to handle that evidence? What conclusions ought we come to, or at least what range of conclusions are we supposed to come to with that evidence? This is the deeper layer of theory of knowledge. Again, what truths, if there are any, are supposed to be understood from the things that we witness? Now, part of this question, because it's a work of fiction, will blend into the author's intention. Again, what did Scott want? What did Steelwool intend with this piece of evidence, right? Those are sort of the questions that come up with these things. What is this thing supposed to mean? What are they trying to tell us with this evidence, right? I don't want to focus here on the author side of things. I just want to focus on it from our perspective. What do we think the range of what we're supposed to take from evidence in the game is? The viewer, the theorist. Your answer to this question, I think, is a bit of a spectrum between what I would call, or what theory of knowledge would call, the school of empiricism, which is on this left side over here, and rationalism, or you can meme it and call it irrationalism, but on this side here. So empiricism in theory of knowledge is more of a belief that what you see and what you hear is really just direct knowledge intended to be accepted at face value, and that the answers to any possible questions of the universe should really just be right in front of you. There's nothing else to really conclude drastically. And in fact, the only conclusion you need to make is that what you see is what you get with the universe. And so in relation to FNAF, that would mean, look, the evidence is supposed to be very direct. We're supposed to just take it at face value. We're not supposed to make all these logical leaps. The answers to the mysteries are meant to be more obvious. Another way of phrasing that is that if you're more on this side of things, you might think that the game writing is more shallow than other people do. You might think that it's just not that deep. You might think that the more you go on this side of things with theories, people are stretching the information. They're taking too many logical leaps that were unintended. That's the major thing I need to illustrate here with this chart, is that most of your problems with other people's theories are going to come from wherever you think you are on this line. You probably think they're too far towards indirect evidence, missing leaks, making leaps in conclusions. That's usually a lot of people's problems with other people's theories, but they don't really know how to articulate that, because how do you without a master's degree in philosophy? I'm not, regular people aren't reading this stuff, but I'm here to help. I went completely off script here, so give me a second to find it. Right, so when this spectrum comes to reference in FNAF, it's basically when it comes to the evidence for the theories in the games, or anywhere we find evidence. We've already solved the question of if the evidence is valid or not. Now we're just asking the question, what do we do with that evidence? How far are we supposed to stretch this evidence, right? How much are we expected to, or intended to, supposed to jump to conclusions? Again, you might think one fact is just right here. It's all it's supposed to be. Someone else might say, no, we're supposed to make an inference here. We're supposed to extrapolate something from this, maybe using another piece of evidence that doesn't really solve anything on its own, and then say, oh, these two together, they make something, right? So it's not crazy to get over to this side. It's just about how far you're willing to go. That's when theories get, I think we would call it wild or crazy or out of line. Okay. Again, another way to explain this is how obvious you think the clues in the series are supposed to be to solve. Again, if you think the game's mysteries are a little more obvious, you're probably more on this side of things. You're more to the left here. If you think that it is more of a deeper mystery, we don't have all the information yet, we need to keep digging, you're probably more this way. Again, probably. To give an example of this, because it still might be hard to wrap your head around, Gibby has recently released a video about Midnight Motorist, and he uses the name Juniors, JRs, as evidence for his theory. Do you believe that the name Juniors was supposed to give us a hint that Jeremy and Fritz are juniors and the sons of the security guards from FNAF 2? Are we supposed to make that far of a conclusion without concrete evidence, like a piece of paper that just directly says, rest in peace to the MCI victims, Jeremy Fitzgerald Jr. and Fritz Smith Jr.? Are we supposed to, how much do you buy Gibby's theory? You're probably more over here if you're willing to accept that bit of a logical leap, right? That amount of missing evidence, that amount of sort of indirect, circumstantial things that potentially line up. Or do you think it's just a bar called Juniors just because, and it was not supposed to be in anything else? In that case, you're on the empirical side of things. You think, look, it's just a bar called Juniors, man. It's not that deep. That's probably a good way of, if you're on this side of things compared to another theory, you're probably thinking it's not that deep. Okay. Where, on the other hand, if you're on this side of stuff a lot of the time, you might think, dude, these theories over here, these guys are too basic. They're not thinking hard enough. They're not thinking galaxy brain enough or deep enough about the solutions to the mysteries. They're never going to get it because they're over here and this is just a regular mystery land. Whereas we're thinking this is a serious business, right? Another great example of this is going to be 14 theory. Again, if you think 14 theory is crazy, if you think it's too much of a stretch, you probably lie more in this direction, or at least to the left of, on my line chart anyway, of where 14 theorizing goes. Again, do you think a slanted number 14 on a locker is supposed to be evidence of, I don't actually know the entirety of 14 theory. Sorry. I was not supposed to go off script there. If you think it's crazy, too much of a stretch, you're probably on this side. Now, if you take 14 theory completely straight, completely seriously, again, not judging, do whatever you want. And if you only disagree with 14 theory potentially because of some other problem and not this sort of theory of knowledge problem of it's too deep, it's too much of a stretch, what are we doing here? A locker, really? You're probably on this side. You're getting wild with your theories. You're having fun, man. Honestly, you're probably having more fun on this side of things. I'm more, I don't know. I'm more here maybe. But I love what people are doing over here. I'm willing to accelerate it. I want people to think of crazy crack theories. Keep on going. So everything that I've said here, I think the meat and potatoes of it comes down to this spectrum. I think it is very significant when it comes to what kinds of theories you are personally going to buy and where you are going to start to completely disagree or not care. I really think this is why a lot of people don't like certain theories and they don't really know how to put their finger on it. They just say, that's just too much for me. I don't know, or like, really, you think that far? You're probably on this side, you're on the left side of that theory. And it's a little too rational in the sense of it's asking you to get too galaxy brain about it for your tastes. That's probably what's going on. Okay? I think that's all I've got. Let's do a quick rehash here. Again, we're talking about what do we actually know about the game's story and characters? How do we know those facts? Where does that proof come from? What evidence can or cannot be trusted in relation to the games or the books or any other media? And then what can we know based on that evidence that is given us? How far are we supposed to go with our conclusions? That's it. Sick meme because I'm young and relatable. Like, comment, subscribe if you feel like it. I have a job. I'm just doing this for the love of the game, man. I hope you got something out of this. Let me know if you're still confused and I can clarify something in the comments. Yeah, that's really it. I'm done here. Have a great day.